Good morning. My name is Tom Reid. Welcome you to this broadband webinar. We can discuss what we've studied and the findings we've had and kind of a profile of how we think the problem can be solved in the area. Brett, did you want to say anything?
Hey everyone, it's Brett Hoffman from Buckeye Hills. I just want to thank you for tuning in today. This has been informative and important work for us, and we're excited to share it with you. So thanks for your time.
Thanks, Brett. So this project was initially funded by the Appalachian Regional Commission based on a project applied for by the Buckeye Hills Regional Council, Ohio University, and the Athens County Economic Development Council. We completed that work, and we're joined by the Southern Ohio Healthcare Network and the Appalachian Partnership for Economic Growth in funding the continued efforts to handle the advocacy and research work that we've been doing so far. So what we're going to talk about today is what we found regarding broadband, the network architectures that we think can help solve it, the magnitude of the funding required, and that we really got a pretty long road. No matter how we do it, it's going to take a while to complete the projects because they are infrastructure projects. So this picture, unfortunately, is a reality far too familiar in our area, where we've got students and job seekers going anywhere they can to get broadband services. In this case, it's a McDonald's, which is a common place for people to go. And the Wall Street Journal covered this back in 2006 or 2013, and just last November did a follow-up story. And unfortunately, what we see is not much has improved in the last 6 years. The reason we still have issues with broadband in our region really ties back to population density. So if you look at a place like Columbus, 1,500 households per square mile, median income about $50,000 per household. Get down to a town like McConnellsville, you're almost at 500 households per square mile and half the household income. But even at those levels, it's a sustainable business model to offer broadband. What we're focused on is the lack of broadband in what we call the rural expanse, areas with 20 or fewer households per square mile. So if you look at Meigs County, the entire county, including the towns, comes out to about 26 households per square mile. And you'll see that in other areas, we get down into 17, 12, even 10 households per square mile in a lot of our areas. And the reality is that no terrestrial broadband provider can serve these areas at 100% of the households without some sort of subsidy, that there is no way to build a business model to reach 100% of these households in the rural expanse. And what we've learned from the analysis is the digital desert persists. So we were funded by the ARC to focus on these particular 8 counties. And all of the shaded areas are areas that the FCC would say lack broadband. Well, we're convinced that it's even worse than this, but this is the FCC's current definition. It's a pretty stark picture. And when we expand that across the whole 37 counties, you can see, again, all these shaded areas are areas that don't have at least the 25 meg down, 3 meg up that the FCC defines as broadband today. So it's a large portion of the area. And again, you may be looking at this map and going, wait a second, I see areas that aren't shaded red, and I know there's no broadband there. Well, this is what the FCC would say. There's no broadband in our area, even though we know the situation is worse than what's pictured here. Significantly worse. So the FCC would indicate that about 38% of the rural expanse has unserved households. We, based on our analysis, came up with 80 to 90% of this rural expanse households are unserved, which is it's not hard to understand why we're having difficulties with economic development in these areas. We're not the only people calling this out. So the FCC says there's 25 million people in the United States without access to 25.3. Microsoft says it's 163 million. So there's a lot of people that are scrutinizing the FCC data. The FCC recognizes they have problems there and are planning on refining it. But right now we're stuck with their existing models. But FCC is calling out a 7-to-1 overestimation of coverage. And the reason that we found, the way that we found that the lack of broadband in the rural expanse is much worse than the FCC says is based on this issue that I'll illustrate here. So show a couple census blocks here. The bigger census block, about 740 acres. There's 14 households in that block. And a carrier was funded to serve that census block. And what they did is way down there in the lower southeastern corner of that block, a single connection was installed at 10 megabits per second. And according to FCC mapping, then that entire census block is served. So all of these households that are in that census block, all these other households in the census block, according to the FCC, are served, but they can't get anything at all. There's no broadband available to them whatsoever. The same carrier then moved further along the road, served another household at 10 megabits, and that whole census block gets marked as served. So this has a very dramatic impact. In this example, it's a 13-to-1 overestimation of coverage. And the basic issue here is that FCC, I think, just working from the DC Beltway, just didn't really understand rural America and the realities of rural America. Where in an urban area or a town, a census block will be 2 acres to 6 acres. But in southeastern Ohio, we can be as big as 3,500 acres. So this diagram shows the comparison of 740 acres, the example we used in the last slide, to the 2 acres and 6 acres. So saying in the southeast corner, you can serve one household in an urban or town, yeah, maybe it's reasonable to say you could serve the rest of that census block. But in the rural expanse, it's not. The other thing we learned, which was disturbing, was that a lot of telephone services, plain old wired telephone services in our area, are also deteriorating to the point of being unusable. We did Freedom of Information Act requests to the Public Utilities Commission of Ohio, seeking broadband and telephone complaints for the last 2 years. The PUCO came back and wanted us to narrow it down, so we narrowed it all the way down to 2 months of 2019. Then they wanted to narrow it down to the number of carriers, and they were being very cooperative. They just said it was too much data. And when we got the first release of data from the PUCO, it was a single carrier, 2 months of 2019, 340 pages of complaints about telephone and broadband services. And I think that reflects this deterioration of the copper cables.
Hi, how are you?
Somebody could mute there, that'd be handy. We're hearing your conversations. And then doubling down on the woes, the mobile services are also very overstated. So in these yellow shaded areas on this map, those are the areas that the FCC up until late in 2019 believed that there were no mobile services. Everywhere else they felt there were mobile services. And then the Ohio Department of Transportation paid a contractor to drive the state routes and county routes in a number of our counties. And all the red lines are areas along those roads where that contractor could not get a signal from any of the 4 major carriers. So the FCC says only the yellow areas don't have mobile. Reality is that it's much, much worse than that. And you'll see that that's typical across the study area. Noble County right now has completed their drive testing. The data is not available yet, but we'll be able to fill that in once that data is available. So it's a pretty stark picture. So we end up with, in the reality these folks are facing, is there's no broadband, there's no mobile services, and their wired telephone lines aren't working very well. So in trying to compete in the 2020 economy, it's just a horrible mismatch. So we don't want to just point out the problems, we want to figure out how we can solve the problems. So our next step was to develop overarching architectures. So in this effort, we selected representative study areas that were typical of our area in terms of terrain and population density, and then modeled technology options to determine what would work to cover 100% of the households. Everyone involved in the project wanted to make sure that we could do 100% of the households. They didn't want to deal with a 50% solution or 75% solution. We didn't want to leave anyone behind. And we looked at three options: satellite, a hybrid of wireless and fiber to the premise. So our first engineering zone was in Meigs County. Again, typical population density, terrain and foliage cover. And if we did this with fiber, there's 930 households in this study area. It'd take about 116 miles of fiber. And you'll see all the blue lines in this drawing would be that fiber. So looking at satellite, there are a lot of issues with satellite services. Because it's coming from space, there are round trip signal delays that create difficulties in doing real-time things like video conferencing and audio conferencing. There's data caps. So once you exceed the data cap, your service is degraded significantly. There's very weak signals that come from satellites, so it's pretty easy to have those signals interfered with. And then to solve some of these problems, there are companies that are launching low orbit satellites. So they're much closer to the Earth. And it's interesting, there's a lot left technically to work out. But one kind of Achilles heel for all these satellite services is you need a clear view of the sky. That's difficult to achieve for a lot of our households because of the terrain and because of the foliage. So we think if satellite, if you don't have anything else you can get, sure, subscribe to satellite services. We do not think it should be a government funded or a government subsidized solution. So for a long time, I thought that our answer would be a combination of wireless and fiber. And when you look at what it looks like in northwestern Ohio from a 300-foot tower in the farmlands, you can see why that's a very attractive methodology in those types of areas. But in Appalachia, it's a totally different picture. We've got our beautiful terrain, our heavy foliage cover, and so we get terrain shadows, and then we also lose all of the high frequency options from the foliage because the high frequency options get absorbed by the foliage. So to test this out, we selected 3 tower locations in our first study area, and we sited them optimally, not based on whether we could get infrastructure there or whether we could acquire the land, but just let's pick spots that will give us the best coverage possible. So we modeled them as 300-foot towers, and the purple shaded areas are areas that you could receive signal. And the white areas are areas where you still can't get a signal from any of the 3 towers. And these are just terrain shadows. This doesn't include obstructions, other types of obstructions or interference from foliage. So you can see that there's a lot of areas we still couldn't reach, even with $1.5 million of infrastructure built into the area. And with the goal of reaching 100% of the households, we dismissed wireless as an option. So that leaves us with fiber to the home. And generally, you look at what's called passing the homes first, just getting close to the homes. We primarily focus on using existing utility poles because, well, you might want to bury, there's a lot of rock not very deep in the surface in this area. So some areas you could bury, but in a lot of areas, we'll be using the existing utility poles. So you pass the homes, then you have the additional costs for the subscribers to actually serve the homes and then operate it. The fiber option has tremendous capacity, just great opportunity to grow over time. It's stable. Capital costs are high, operating costs are low. I get probably 30 years out of the infrastructure. And it's also a foundation for extending mobile services in a lot of these areas. So we're pretty excited about the possibility that fiber infrastructure can be built here, because it would finally leapfrog our region. Instead of always being lagging behind in capabilities, we'd be ahead of the game. And I've also felt like, boy, fiber, it's going to be really tough to cost justify a fiber build in our area. But I've been pleasantly surprised when you compare it to other types of infrastructure investments. So if you look at highways, it's got $10 to $20 million to build a 4-lane highway, and that's the fully loaded cost. And then the government has to continue to fund the upkeep. In fiber, we're going to be talking to about $50,000 to $60,000 per mile, and the ISP that ends up offering services across it will deliver the upkeep. At Nelsonville Bypass, 8.5 miles, about 160 million, so about 19 million a mile. And so when we look at what it'll take to build out fiber to the home, if we look at just the 8-county study area and we want to do all of those shaded areas, all the areas that are below 25.3, it'd be about 2,700 square miles, 58,000 households. And the total cost of building the network is going to be about almost $500 million. And it should generate about $130 million in revenue, which leaves about $360 million in required subsidy. And that sounds like a whole lot of money, and it is, but a highway equivalent will only be about 19 miles of highway. So I think when you put it in that kind of context, the benefits of fiber to the home compared to 19 miles of highway works out pretty well. When we look at the 34 counties, we haven't added the additional 3 counties in that far north area yet. But you'll look at the 34 counties, it's a whopping $1.7 billion that we need to subsidize the fiber construction. But it's less than 90 miles of highway equivalency. So again, these are not unachievable. This is work that's happened in these areas before, building 32, building 35. I really think we could make this happen. And it's a lot of households that would be impacted. So, where do we get the money? It's a lot of money. Where can the money come from? There's the FCC Rural Digital Opportunity Fund. Used to be called the Connect America Fund, but the FCC chairman, Chairman Pai, he likes to rebrand things. So he decided to call it the Rural Digital Opportunity Fund. It's $20 billion in subsidy distributed via reverse auction. And then the Rural 5G Fund, that used to be called the Mobility Fund. In late 2019, Chairman Pai threw out all of the existing coverage maps. He'd seen enough examples about how bad the mobile coverage maps were that he just said, okay, obviously we have no idea where there is and is not mobile coverage. We'll just throw all those maps out. He rebranded it to the Rural 5G Fund and doubled the size of the program to $9 billion. So we also have USDA Reconnect. There's a funding window open right now for USDA Reconnect. It's about $300 million in grants. You can also get loans, but what we're looking for are grant subsidies. The Appalachian Regional Commission also has a window open right now for about $25 million. State of Ohio is getting closer to having its own broadband fund. Not sure how much money is going to be in there, but it's good to have the state of Ohio join in this effort as well. And then if you listen to the various presidential candidates, and there's some movement in the existing Congress as well, there's a lot of interest in having a federal infrastructure fund, and everybody includes broadband money as one of their talking points. So it's hard to say what's going to come from that, but at least people are talking about it. But we primarily have been focusing on the 2 FCC programs because they're almost 100 times bigger than USDA Reconnect. So just in terms of trying to get the impact we need, that's been our primary focus, is on the FCC programs. And I wanted to mention that these FCC programs are not some new giveaway. This is not some new tax-based program that is targeting any specific group of people. This comes from the Universal Service Fund, which dates all the way back to 1934, because Congress realized we needed telephone services in rural areas to be at equivalent cost to telephone services in urban areas. And so the Universal Service Fund was established to do that. And just in the last few years, what they've done is say, okay, it's no longer about telephone services, it's about broadband. These are based on surcharges on telephone bills is where the money comes from. So this picture we looked at before, how bad it is in the 37 counties in terms of broadband access. But that also calls out opportunity right now, because the Rural Digital Opportunity Fund auction is going to start on October 22nd of this year. And the monthly subsidies that we should see are calculated on a per household basis. We should see monthly subsidies of between $57 and $86 in our area. And those are provided over a 10-year period. So $6,800 over $10,000 over the 10-year period. Now, this is going to be subject to a reverse auction. So they might offer $8,500 per household in a certain census block, and then people are going to bid on that. And the low bid, it's a combination of low bid and best service, will end up winning. But in our area, that 37 county area, we think there's about 200,000 households that lack 25/3 broadband. The FCC numbers should come in more like 140 to 175,000 households that will qualify for the auction. And that should bring in somewhere between $900 million and $1.4 billion into southern and eastern Ohio. So it's a lot of money, and it's actually enough to do the fiber to the home efforts. One thing I want to say though is, let's say RDOF is the way it gets solved in our area. It's going to take time, and this is just an example timeline. So just in late January, early February, the RDOF order was voted on late January. It was released in early February. And then at some point this quarter or next quarter, they're going to release eligible census blocks and conduct a challenge process. Then in October, as I mentioned, they'll do the phase 1 auction where they're going to dispense 14 of the $20 billion. And then if you're one of those winners of the auction, then you go into due diligence. And the due diligence in these kinds of efforts, in the previous FCC efforts, have taken about a year. So it'll probably be late 2021 before the money gets released. And then the auction winner has 3 years to reach 40% of the homes, 6 years to reach 100% of the homes. So we're dealing with 2027. If somebody wins the auction in our area, 2027 before they have to be at 100% of the homes. So it's just important, as people are super frustrated about the broadband situation in our area, and I completely agree with them. But no matter how it goes, in terms of resolving it, it's going to take a long time, and I think it's important that we share that message, that it's not, there is no instant fix. Somebody could come in and drop $2 billion on our desk today, and it's still going to take us 6 years to build it out, because it is a complex infrastructure issue. And this would be true for USDA. Any sort of infrastructure program is going to take time to build out. So next steps, I want you to continue voicing your concerns, state and federal legislators. I encourage anyone who's interested in participating to get involved with the Rural Digital Opportunity Fund. It's not a simple process, but it's not a terribly complex process either to participate in the auction. And so you have to be either someone who's provided internet services for the last 2 years, or someone who's provided electrical services for the last 2 years to qualify. And join us and the partners in supporting these advocacy and research efforts. So that's all I have as kind of the boilerplate discussion. I do have a lot of other information. I can pull up data on specific counties, on specific programs. So I just wanted to open it up at this point to questions.
Hey, Tom, this is Gwen in Noble County. Is there a process for shooting out the details on the FCC to the providers in the area?
That's a good question. I don't think we've got a uniform process to do that at this stage.
So we're just assuming they're going to see it and apply if they're interested.
Yeah, we've talked to some entities, but we should make it more make sure it's a thorough process.
Thanks.
Good thought, Gwen. Other questions, suggestions, comments? If you're talking, you might be muted. So.
Tom, it's Brett. I'll add in a couple things.
Yeah,
so for the folks that are on, I want to thank you for tuning in, and all the information that we've created through the feasibility process and the data, the maps, various policies, other documents, the state's broadband strategy document, all those things are at buckeyehills.org/broadband. So we've been updating that page very regularly. So bookmark that and evaluate and look at the resources that are out there. We've put them out there for the benefit of all our members. So that's where we've been putting all the work, all the results of the work we've been doing. So I encourage you to connect there. And then feel free to, as the effort goes on, please feel free to reach out to Misty or myself. And if we're fortunate enough to keep Tom around much longer, please reach out to Tom as well. But this has been very interesting work from us. It's really, I think, started to move the needle in a way that we really haven't been successful at in previous efforts. So this has been really meaningful for us. So we're grateful for everybody's partnership, and I'm really looking forward to what we are able to do next. So.
Appreciate that. Anything else, anybody? All right, well, as Brett said, thanks very much for spending time with us today, and hopefully we don't have to talk about broadband once RDOF auction happens and things are taken care of. It's been a long and frustrating process to try to solve these issues, and maybe we'll get it right this time. I certainly hope so. All right, have a good day.
Thanks, Tom.
Welcome.